You know that moment when a game gets slammed by critics and you're left wondering if it's even worth your time? Well, sometimes the reviews don't tell the whole story, and beneath those low scores and harsh headlines might be a hidden gem just waiting to surprise you. Today, I'll be showing you 15 incredible games that got unfairly trashed by reviews.
The deep cut.
Let's kick things off with Biomutant. Let me just say, Biomutant has this energy that's hard to describe. You know how most post-apocalyptic games go for dark, gritty, and borderline depressing? Not this one. It's like someone looked at a watercolor painting, cranked the saturation, and threw in martial arts and mutant raccoons. I mean, first impressions here are wild. You're this genetically modified, kung fu kicking critter, wandering a massive open world that feels almost like a storybook came to life. Now, here's the thing with Biomutant. The ambition is insane, almost overwhelming. There's this sprawling world with big moral decisions about whether to save or restart existence, factions to align with, and dozens of mechanics piling on top of each other. That freedom is both its greatest strength and possibly its biggest flaw. Critics didn't really vibe with how the systems felt disconnected. The combat, for instance. It's got this flashy kung fu gunplay mashup going on, but after a while, it starts feeling like you've done it all. And then there's the narrator, this ever-present voice walking you through everything. At first, it's whimsical and kind of charming. But after hours of play, it's more like you want to mute the guy so you can enjoy the weirdness in peace. Still, the visual style alone makes it worth exploring. It's colorful, bizarre, and packed with these little environmental details that make you want to stop and just soak it in. Plus, that crafting system, it's a playground for creativity. Slap together a sword with duct tape and gears, or craft some bonkers weapon that makes no sense yet somehow works. Biomutant isn't perfect, it's jagged and experimental, but that unevenness gives it an identity and heart that's hard to ignore. Next up is The Evil Within. Survival horror doesn't usually stick with me. Like, I don't typically play games to get my stress levels through the roof, you know. The Evil Within, though, this one got under my skin in ways I didn't expect. So, imagine Silent Hill's creeping dread married to Resident Evil's grotesque monstrosities, and you've pretty much got the vibe here. Shinji Mikami, the Resident Evil 4 legend, directed this, and you can feel his fingerprints all over it. It dropped in 2014, and yeah, the reviews were a little mixed. People called out some clunky mechanics and outdated design choices, but when it comes to pure atmosphere, this game gets it right. You step into the role of Sebastian Castellanos, a detective who gets drawn into this twisted, nightmarish world. And when I say twisted, I mean what the hell is happening levels of weird. There's this unsettling blend of psychological horror and straight-up gore, where one second you're sneaking past a massive dude with a meat cleaver, and the next you're trying to unravel a surreal, fragmented storyline that makes you question what's real. It's a lot, but it works, mostly because it keeps you on edge the entire time. By the way, the first chapter is absolutely brutal. It throws you straight into the deep end with this relentless mix of shock and terror. I almost tapped out here. It's tough in a way that almost feels unfair, but once I pushed through, I got hooked by the weirdly compelling story. It's not perfect though. Some of the mechanics, like stealth and movement, feel a bit stiff by today's standards. And the spikes in difficulty, let's just say they occasionally had me on the verge of turning off my console for a palate cleanser. That said, there's something about the game's relentless atmosphere that makes it stand tall among survival horror greats. If you're not into games that stress you out, this might be a gamble, but it's on Xbox Game Pass, so giving it a spin is super low risk. Unfortunately, if you're on PlayStation, this game just left the PS Plus a few months ago. Next up, we have Remember Me. I'll start here. Remember Me deserved better when it first dropped in 2013. This was Dontnod Entertainment's debut project before they hit it big with Life is Strange, and looking back, the ambition they had was kind of incredible. Picture this, a dystopian Neo-Paris where memories are currency, technology has spiraled out of control, and you, Neelan, are a memory hunter trying to take down the system. Already, it sounds gripping, right? And visually, the world is stunning. Sharp neon signs lighting up derelict neighborhoods, sleek sci-fi architecture clashing with gritty back alleys. It's a cyberpunk dream filtered through a distinctly European lens. Now, the gameplay's got some hits and misses. Let's talk memory remixing, the mechanic that makes this game stand out. You dive into someone's mind and tinker with their memories to change how they perceive the past. It's clever, almost like solving an interactive puzzle inside someone's head. The only downside is that there's not enough of it. The few remix sequences are so inventive that you'll find yourself wanting more, and those moments almost overshadow the rest of the game. Combat, on the other hand, tries to offer depth with a customizable combo system. You can tweak your attacks to heal you, increase damage, or speed up cooldowns on your special powers. Cool in theory, but it starts to drag. Encounters can feel repetitive, and the let's throw in all the enemies at once approach makes it obvious where the cracks are. Movement and platforming is straightforward. You've got some parkour, but don't expect anything on Uncharted's level. The story is where Remember Me finds its rhythm. Nilin is a compelling lead, and the narrative digs into some heavy themes. Memory, identity, control, all wrapped in a solid cyberpunk package. It's frustrating though, because even with such a smart setting and concept, the game feels like it's just scratching the surface of what it could have been. Still, it's one of those experiences that sticks with you. If you love creative worlds and bold ideas, this game might remind you why you started gaming in the first place.
Boozer, you there? I was just calling to check up on you.
Up next, we have Days Gone. When this hit in 2019, critics, well, they kind of gave it the cold shoulder. You've probably heard the usual gripes: repetitive missions, technical hiccups, an open world that felt a little barren. And yeah, it didn't help that it dropped in a year stacked with heavy hitters like Sekiro and Resident Evil 2. It just didn't seem to leave much of a mark at first. But you know what's funny? Players slowly turned this one into a cult classic, like it was some secret worth sharing years later. They connected with it in ways critics maybe didn't. And our protagonist might seem like your average angry biker archetype, but stick with the game, and you'll start seeing these cracks in his tough guy facade, his grief, his resolve, his love for Sarah. It gives the game a surprising amount of heart. And his bromance with Boozer, that alone could carry a Netflix miniseries. Then you've got these massive freaker hordes, which to me are where the game says, all right, let me show you what I'm working with. Imagine hundreds of zombies pouring at you like liquid death while you're frantically setting traps and molotoving for your life. It's not just about killing them, it's about surviving them, which is such a rush. And I've got to shout out the bike. It's not just your ride, it's your lifeline. You're upgrading it, fueling it, making sure it handles like a dream. Cruising around the Pacific Northwest on this thing with its gorgeous sunsets and dynamic weather is low-key one of the best parts of the game. Sure, it's a slow burn, but that's kind of the point. Days Gone doesn't immediately slap you. It gets under your skin until suddenly, you can't stop playing. It's patched up now, runs beautifully on PC, and feels like it finally got its chance to shine. Not bad for a game that critics tried to bury. Coming in next is Terminator Resistance. You know how Terminator fans have this ongoing love-hate relationship with the franchise? Well, Terminator Resistance came along right after Dark Fate, and it didn't exactly scream hope. No tie-ins, no AAA hype, and let's be real, most licensed games don't have the best track record. Critics were not kind. On the surface, it's easy to see why. Muddy visuals that felt a generation behind, gameplay mechanics that lacked polish, and a vibe that screamed mid-budget passion project. A lot of them wrote it off as just another soulless use of the Terminator name and slapped on some abysmal review scores. The PS4 version hit a brutal 4.6 user score at launch, though weirdly enough, the PC release got a bit more wiggle room with a 60 Metascore. But here's the thing. Fans started playing it and realizing this isn't that bad. In fact, for some, it was actually fun. The Steam reviews tell a different story altogether. 13,000 plus very positive ratings now, and people are calling it surprisingly good. Maybe the timing helped. After so many bad movies, and let's be honest, Dark Fate didn't do much to help, the bar for Terminator games was basically underground. Instead of chasing blockbuster ambitions, Resistance just focused on being functional and competent. It captured the gloomy, machine-overrun tone of the franchise and gave fans exactly what they were craving. A story that fits the Terminator lore, some basic stealth shooter action, and, crucially, a sense of nostalgia. So yeah, the clunkiness is still baked into its DNA, but if you're a long-suffering Terminator fan just wanting something that respects the world a little, this might be the sleeper hit nobody saw coming. It probably never deserved the brutality of those early reviews anyway.
You die today.
Next up is Ryse, Son of Rome. If we're talking launch titles, Ryse Son of Rome had the entire weight of the Xbox One's debut resting on its shoulders. Back then, Crytek seemed hell-bent on showing what next-gen really meant, and visually, it delivered. This game still looks insane. Like, staring at that Roman architecture, you almost feel like you're in some glossy historical documentary. Animations, lighting, reflections, it's all top tier. Though, you'd be surprised to hear that Crytek initially planned for Ryse to be a Kinect game. Yup, motion-controlled sword swinging and shield blocking. Imagine that. Thankfully, they pivoted, and we got this bloody revenge tale about Marius Titus instead. Now, let's talk about the combat. Critics went hard on it, calling it shallow, repetitive, even too cinematic. A lot of it boils down to simple hack-and-slash combos sprinkled with quick-time executions, admittedly not the deepest gameplay loop. But here's the wild part. Over time, people came around. What initially felt like a limitation now feels intentional. Like, the simple combat lets you focus on the jaw-dropping spectacle and the unfolding drama rather than fumbling with combos. And the story. Man's family gets wiped out, he climbs the ranks, and seeks revenge. It's straightforward, sure, but I'd argue there's a certain charm in how unapologetically epic it feels. As short-lived as its campaign might be, Ryse is at its best when you're soaking in the sheer theatricality of it all. Whether you're marching with an army, storming a beach, or impaling barbarians on the battlefield, it nails that larger-than-life Roman vibe perfectly. Honestly, it's less about what it lacks, and more about appreciating what works. Kind of like watching a flashy historical epic where you don't have to suffer through bad monologues. So if you've got a few hours to kill, Ryse might surprise you. It's not the masterpiece Crytek wanted it to be, but as a slice of ancient Rome wrapped in next-gen polish, there's still plenty worth admiring. Coming in next is the Callisto Protocol. If you saw the name Glenn Schofield attached to it and thought Dead Space 2.0, you weren't alone. Glenn basically is one of the minds behind Dead Space, so there was this huge weight of expectation the second the game was announced. And man, when it dropped in December 2022, anticipation was sky high. But reception? All over the map. You play Jacob Lee, a dude who gets chucked into a creepy prison on one of Jupiter's moons. And surprise, surprise, it turns into a gore-drenched nightmare when something called the biophages take over. The stakes are the classic survival horror. But here's where the mixed bag comes in. First, atmosphere. Nailed it. Like visually, this game is a chef's kiss. From the unsettling corridors of Black Iron to the ominous growl of something lurking around the corner, the Callisto Protocol makes you feel like you're constantly being watched. The way the light flickers off the blood-soaked walls, pure tension. And that sound design, it's just chilling. The game really knows how to make those background screeches and whispers crawl under your skin. But then comes the combat. Critics tore into it because half of the game's strategy revolves around a weird, dodge-heavy mechanic that can feel clunky. Like you're trying to survive these gnarly body horror enemies, and there's this awkward, rhythmic dodging going on that doesn't feel intuitive. And don't even get me started on its launch. If you were on PC, the stuttering drove people insane. It's mostly fixed now, but it left a mark. Still, if you can push through that combat funk, there's an eerie, jaw-dropping sci-fi horror game underneath. You just have to meet it on its terms and not walk in expecting a Dead Space repeat. It's doing its own thing, for better or worse. Next on the list, we have Spec Ops: The Line. You know this game, right? Or maybe you don't, because when it came out in 2012, a lot of people thought it was just another military shooter, like one of those dime-a-dozen third-person cover games. And yeah, on the surface, it kind of is. Straightforward mechanics, firefights aplenty. It doesn't exactly reinvent the wheel gameplay-wise. Critics were lukewarm, calling it competently made, but nothing special. High praise, huh? But then you start peeling back the layers, and suddenly this unassuming shooter starts hitting on levels most games wouldn't dare to touch. You play as Captain Martin Walker. You and your squad are sent into a sand-swallowed Dubai to find a missing colonel. Sounds boilerplate, except it's not. Something about this game digs into you. The deeper you go, the more the story refuses to let you stay comfortable. It's ugly, psychological, incredibly flawed. Kind of like Walker himself by the end of it. Inspired by Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the game builds itself around moral ambiguity and the mental toll of war. Those choices players love so much. Here, they'll make you squirm. There's no right path, only what feels less soul-crushing in the moment. The visuals work over time too. Sand doesn't just sculpt the landscape, it's a character itself, swallowing everything in sight. By the time you hit the endings, multiple by the way, you're just left reeling. Forget resolution, Spec Ops doesn't do neat bows. Back in the day, folks fixated on the middling multiplayer and cover system when they should have been talking about its bravery. It's a game made to make you feel uncomfortable, guilty even, and that's why it lingers long after you put the controller down. Next up, we have Watch Dogs. You know, Watch Dogs was supposed to be the game that redefined open-world storytelling, hacking mechanics, and visuals for a new generation. Ubisoft rolled out the red carpet, promised the world, and set expectations to sky-high levels with that jaw-dropping E3 2012 reveal. And let's face it, even today, that trailer still looks stunning. But when the game finally launched in 2014, it was like watching a balloon slowly deflate. The infamous graphical downgrade took center stage. The rain-soaked, neon-lit streets of Chicago we were promised had turned into something fine but nowhere close to revolutionary. That visual disparity arguably overshadowed everything. For many players, it felt like a bait and switch. And then there's Aiden Pierce. I mean, the idea of a hacker vigilante seeking revenge sounds promising, sure. The problem was Aiden himself, emotionally flat, perpetually grim, and just kind of there. It was hard to connect with his personal vendetta when he brought about as much energy as an unplugged router. The story leaned heavily into its serious tone, which might have worked better if Ubisoft hadn't baked in this chaotic, almost playful hacking system. The dissonance between those elements threw a lot of people off. But stepping back now, Watch Dogs has aged more gracefully than you'd expect. The hacking mechanics is still impressive. Flipping traffic lights to cause a car chase pileup or manipulating cameras to stealth your way through enemy zones feels fresh even today. And modern patches have cleaned it up graphically, making that open-world Chicago, while maybe not on GTA's personality level, a lively, interactive playground. If you skipped it because of all the noise back in 2014, give it another shot. It's a fascinating, flawed start to a franchise that eventually found its stride. Next, we've got Vampyr. This one's a slow burn, but it's got some serious atmosphere. Vampyr feels like stepping into a gothic novel you didn't know you needed in your life. It's 1918 London, post-World War I, with the Spanish flu taking out half the city. You play as Dr. Jonathan Reed, a war veteran turned vampire, and straight away the game puts you into this constant moral tension. You're drawn to help people because, you're a doctor, but you're also a vampire, so you need to feed to grow stronger. That setup alone had me hooked because every meal isn't just a stat boost, it's a choice, and one you'll have to live with. And the NPCs aren't just faceless victims either. Each has a story, a role to play in the fragile ecosystem of their neighborhood. Decide to snack on the wrong person, and suddenly the entire area starts to crumble. It almost forces you to roleplay Reed's internal struggle of trying to do the right thing while battling his nature. It's refreshing in a time when many RPGs throw choices at you, but the stakes rarely ever hit this hard. Now, about the gameplay. The combat can feel clunky, like it's almost there but missing polish. The vampiric powers sound cooler than they end up feeling, and the melee and gunplay could have used a bit more weight. It's not bad, just serviceable, which is fine because the focus is clearly on the moral dilemmas and the story. Speaking of which, the overall pacing is slow, but the narrative holds it together, and the moody atmosphere? Oh, it absolutely steals the show. Creeping through foggy London streets while unraveling the mystery of Reed's curse is just immersive. Vampyr may not reach perfection, but it's unapologetically unique. If you're into rich, morally complex stories and can forgive some gameplay quirks, this one's worth sinking your teeth into. We can't leave out Left Alive. Few games from a major studio have ever been as thoroughly dunked on by critics as this one. I mean, a 37 Metascore on PS4, that's the kind of number that makes developers wince. And yeah, when you break it down, the issues are hard to ignore. The controls felt like you were piloting a tank in quicksand, the stealth mechanics threw brutal a farewell party and went straight into Unkind, and the AI? Let's just say inconsistent is putting it generously. Combine all that with visuals that somehow manage to look dated even in 2019 and glitches straight out of a beta test. And it's no surprise Left Alive became a punchline. Yet, here's the kicker. For all that hate, players apparently saw something the critics didn't. We're talking an 8.1 user score on PS4 and a whopping 8.6 on PC. And before anyone yells out bot accounts, a deeper dive tells a slightly different story. Square Enix actually responded to a lot of the backlash pretty quickly, patching in a casual difficulty. That alone smoothed out some of the more, let's call them unforgiving edges. It didn't fix everything, far from it, but it made the game at least approachable for folks who didn't live and breathe stealth games. And strangely, the game has carved out a weirdly loyal fan base. Its subreddit, alive and kicking with passionate defenders who love dissecting the gritty, dystopian setting and the survival aspects. It's fascinating, honestly. Left Alive feels like it shouldn't have worked. Critics made sure of that, but post-launch tweaks and some players' sheer willpower to engage with it anyway gave the game a second wind. It's rare, but sometimes rough around the edges is just someone else's cup of tea. Next is Quantum Break. Alright, let's just say it. Remedy swung for the fences on Quantum Break. Like, the whole concept is wild. You're not just playing an action game about time travel, you're also watching it unfold in a full-blown TV show. You fight through all this wild time-bending chaos, and then boom, episodes that add these extra layers to the narrative. And somehow it mostly works. I mean, it's a lot to wrap your head around at first, but it ends up being a really cohesive experience if you're into that kind of experimental storytelling. The game itself looks stunning, even now, almost ridiculously so for something that came out back in 2016. The way time fractures during gameplay creates these visually jaw-dropping moments. Remedy always brings their A-game on atmosphere, and Quantum Break is no exception. The shooting mechanics paired with your time powers might not be anything revolutionary, but they're undeniably fun. But here's the thing, not everything lands quite as smoothly. Fans of Remedy's earlier work, like Alan Wake, might have been expecting a bit more gameplay depth here. The platforming sections are kind of a headache, floaty, and almost pointless. The enemy design also feels a bit samey, a missed opportunity when your game's literally about breaking time. And the TV show, super well acted, but its placement kind of disrupts the flow. One second you're in the heat of an intense showdown, and the next, you're watching a 20-minute episode. Some people loved it, others felt it yanked them out of the game. Even with those complaints, there's no denying that Quantum Break is filled with ambition. Remedy wasn't just creating a game, they were experimenting with what games could be. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's the kind of bold, risk-taking project that you don't see enough of today. It's a blast to just experience it, like stepping into a high-concept sci-fi show where you're steering the narrative. If you haven't checked it out, there's nothing quite like it, flaws and all. Now, it's time to highlight Mafia 3. Mafia 3 is kind of like finding a gorgeous, perfectly cooked steak with a side of soggy fries you didn't order. Coming off the near-universally praised Mafia and Mafia 2, expectations couldn't have been higher for Lincoln Clay's journey. Hangar 13 had all the tools for something spectacular, a deeply personal revenge story, a protagonist with true grit, and the altogether unique setting of 1968 New Bordeaux, a reimagined New Orleans drenched in jazz, racial tension, and seething corruption. Narratively, they delivered. Lincoln's quest to dismantle the criminal empire of Sal Marcano hits hard, fueled by themes of justice and revenge, and the cutscenes play out with a cinematic flair that rivals anything in the series. But where things fall apart, for a lot of people at least, is in those repetitive mission structures. Players were tasked with taking over rackets, clearing out the same types of enemy-filled zones, and then rinsing and repeating a lot. You'd catch glimpses of brilliance, moments that made you feel invested in Lincoln's rise to power, but much of the gameplay loop felt like padding. It's as though Hangar 13 wanted to stretch the game's runtime to compete with massive open-world blockbusters, sacrificing the tight, linear storytelling that defined its predecessors. Yet, even so, there's something magnetic about Mafia 3. The world, the music, the atmosphere. This is a game you feel, and when you skip the fluff and stick to the main narrative, it shines. Lincoln's quest is dark, compelling, and raw. Throw in the DLC, especially the island expansion, and you've got a game that redeems itself in big moments. Fiddling with reshade mods to clean up the visuals is worth the effort because, truly, Mafia 3 deserves a second chance. Strip away the bloat, and there's a story here that's unforgettable. Next up is The Ascent. This one is kind of fascinating because it shows how timing can completely change the way people experience a game. If you remember the months leading up to its launch, The Ascent looked like every cyberpunk fan's dream. A gritty, neon-drenched world, twin-stick RPG shooting, and some serious Blade Runner vibes. Microsoft put it front and center in a lot of marketing, so expectations got super inflated. Then it launched, and critics, not exactly kind. Scores landed all over the place. A rough 68 on Xbox Series X, slightly better at 74 on PC. The big complaints are basic shooting mechanics, a story that felt more like background noise, missions that blur together, and yikes, a lot of bugs. For a game in the spotlight like this, that's basically throwing cold water on the hype. Now here's the twist. Regular players loved it, or at least liked it way more. Over on Steam, it's rocking a mostly positive rating from over 17,000 people. Pretty big disconnect, right? A lot of it boils down to timing. Critics played an early version riddled with bugs, but patches rolled out before most players really got their hands on it. So, while the reviewers were drowning in crashes and glitches, a lot of the community got a smoother ride. Add Xbox Game Pass into the mix, where people could try it essentially for free, and those smaller flaws became easier to brush off. And listen, bugs aside, if you're the sort of person who can forgive repetitive missions just to soak in a jaw-dropping atmosphere, this game has that. The Ascent group arcology feels alive, towering, grimy, and absolutely drenched in techno-punk lore. Maybe it's not groundbreaking, but as far as immersing you in its world, it sticks the landing better than critics gave it credit for. Wrapping up the list with MediEvil Remake. Going back to the MediEvil Remake feels like dusting off a golden relic, except, that relic's got a few dents that make you squint. If you were big into the original in '98, this 2019 remake probably hit you square in the nostalgia. Sir Daniel Fortescue's hilarious, bone-clattering journey is still here. The revamped visuals absolutely brought Gallowmere to life with so much extra detail that you almost feel like you're looking at it with rose-tinted glasses. But the gameplay, that's where it gets tricky. Critics had issues, and honestly, you can see why. They took Faithful Remake very seriously, which means a lot of the janky PS1 era quirks came along for the ride. The original's not-so-tight controls? Still there. Terrible camera angles that seem hellbent on hiding enemies behind walls? Yup. And the lack of checkpoints and levels? Oh yeah, you're feeling that when you get knocked out midway through. As a result, reviews landed at a 67 Metascore, basically a solid meh. But players? That's where things flip. The user score hit over 8.1, with a lot of die-hard fans celebrating just how much it feels like MediEvil. If anything, they doubled down on saying critics just didn't get it. The charm of this game lies in remembering how games used to be. A little clunky, a little unforgiving, but also bursting with personality. It wasn't built to compete with modern action adventures, it's a tribute in every sense. And for those who loved Dan's goofy heroics in the 90s, that's more than enough reason to pop the game in and take a nostalgic trip. And there you have it, folks. If you enjoyed watching this video, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.